Something has been happening in the global economy. Everyone seems to be talking about it. We've all been hearing that wealth inequality has been massively rising over the last couple of decades. But there's something that I didn't quite understand. How did wealth inequality get this extreme? And I couldn't stop thinking about it. I got obsessed, trying to understand everything. Researching interest rates, legislation, tax rates, and the exact mechanisms that enabled this massive shift in wealth distribution. One of the first things I did was visit one of my friends, someone who's been researching wealth inequality for over a decade.
So, how come everything's so fucked right now? How come wealth inequality has become this bad?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. So my work has largely been on understanding how wealth inequality affects our economy. And I've been working on that for about 15 years. And in that time, wealth inequality has gotten a lot worse. And I think it's driving a lot of our economic problems. But I would actually like to know a little bit more about how wealth inequality started to increase. So the big picture historical story, from my understanding, is wealth inequality was really very, very bad for most of history in Europe, in the West. And then we have this period starting in World War II, really, where wealth inequality reduces significantly. And with that, we get the rise of the middle class and the big increase in broad living standards that probably our parents lived in. And then we start to see that change. And the obvious time to look at would be the late 70s, early 80s, when we see the beginning of the Thatcher government here in the UK and the Reagan government in the US, who really radically reduced taxes for the top end. So in that post-war period, you had these like 95% top rates of income and inheritance tax, which kept inequality low. And then when Thatcher and Reagan come in, they really aggressively reduce those taxes. And I think that is when you start to see the wealth of the very rich start to grow. Before that, it's not really possible. But what I'm interested in and what I'd like to know a little bit more about is basically how that became possible and also why they did it. Like basically, what were Thatcher and Reagan thinking when they decided to radically reduce tax on the very rich? And why did the public allow it? You should make a video about it.
So, I did. But before we talk about history or ideology or politicians, we need to start with something a lot more simple. Let's start with the obvious question. What is actually happening? How has life become so expensive, so stressful for so many people? Well, the data tells a story you might be familiar with, but I'm still going to mention it to illustrate the magnitude of the wealth inequality we're seeing today. Let's start with the big picture. The top 1% now own more than the bottom 95% of society, and the wealth gap is widening. And this isn't happening slowly. It's happening violently. Since 1979, worker productivity has kept rising, but wages flatlined. This is the moment the economy stopped rewarding labour and started rewarding ownership. While CEO pay skyrocketed, worker pay stayed low, and house prices and the cost of living grew exorbitantly, making life unaffordable for a lot of people. So the question isn't, why is life so hard? The question is, what the fuck actually happened?
There are a few obvious mechanisms making this worse.
Taxes for the wealthy collapsed, corporations barely paying taxes, capital gains, so profits you make on the stock market or through other investments, are taxed less than labour, workers losing bargaining power because unions aren't really a thing anymore, or stock buybacks which funnel profit to shareholders. Of course, it is super easy to just read out this list and say, oh, it's because of this. But listing this out doesn't really explain how this happened and the history and mechanisms that made it possible. Because this didn't happen by accident. It was caused deliberately by decisions made at a very specific moment in history. So in this video, we're diving deep into the history, starting after World War II. After World War II, the world was in chaos. Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed, and the global economy was basically lying face down in the mud. So everyone kind of came together at the Bretton Woods conference. And by everyone, I mean 730 delegates from 44 allied nations, with the United States and the United Kingdom playing lead roles. Germany and Japan, aka the losers, were not invited for obvious reasons. The people who came together at Bretton Woods wanted to kind of avoid the catastrophic conditions that had threatened the world order and democracy during the 1930s, the Great Depression, which was a major contributing factor to World War II. The Great Depression basically nuked the global economy and basically pushed half the world into fascism. Also, if you want to know more about the Great Depression and what caused it, I talk a lot more about it in this video. Anyways, the point is, as we can see today, if people don't have enough resources and cost of living keeps going up, what do people do? They turn to political extremism and start blaming minorities, like immigrants and foreigners, trans people, or in case of pre-World War II Germans, the Jews. Anyways, the people at Bretton Woods, under the leadership of US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. and the British economist John Maynard Keynes, wanted to prevent this to happen again. So they designed a global economic system that would hopefully prevent another Great Depression. So all of these countries signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The most important part of it was that they wanted to provide stability for international trade and investment. And they did that by establishing a fixed exchange rate system, where each country's currency was pegged to the US dollar, which itself was convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. The deal was simple. The US guaranteed that an ounce of gold was worth $35. This way, every other currency could safely anchor itself to the dollar, which was obviously way easier to enable trade because it was just massively impractical to send boatloads full of gold across the Atlantic Ocean every time you did a bigger trade. That is what made the dollar the world's financial centre of gravity. This became the central point of the Bretton Woods system. What also happened during the Bretton Woods conference is that global financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank were created. The important part now is that you remember the fixed exchange rates. And the Bretton Woods system actually worked pretty well. From about 1945 until the early 1970s, life was good. So good that economists now call this period the golden age of capitalism. Economic growth was high because all the factories that had been producing bullets and tanks during the World War were now being used to produce stuff like washing machines. Unemployment was low, housing was affordable, so affordable that it only took about 2 yearly average salaries to buy a house. Inequality was low because labour unions were strong. This was the era where a single income could support an entire family. And it wasn't the free market creating this stability. It was the opposite. A tightly regulated global economic system designed to keep chaos out. Exchange rates were fixed, banks were pretty regulated, corporations couldn't just yeet money into offshore accounts, and unions kept wages tied to productivity. And it worked really well for about 25 years. But the system had one fatal flaw. It only worked as long as the United States remained the global economic anchor. For the system to work, the United States had to keep running a trade surplus, meaning as long as the US exported more than it imported, everything was fine. More stuff was leaving US factories than stuff coming into the US. But in the 1960s, things started to change. The US was bleeding money into the Vietnam War, and Japan and Germany had rebuilt faster than expected and were producing cheaper and better goods than the US. So the US began importing more than it exported, which meant the US stopped running a surplus and started running a trade deficit. This was a massive problem because the Bretton Woods system only worked if the US ran a surplus. The dollar became overextended, which means there were more dollars circulating globally than the US had gold to back them. Foreign governments started losing confidence in the dollar and wanted to redeem their dollars for gold. And the US simply didn't have enough gold to give to them. I know this is kind of complicated, but for now it's just important for you to know that the Bretton Woods system didn't really work anymore. So on the 15th of August 1971, Nixon ended the gold convertibility of the dollar.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve asset.
This detonated the entire Bretton Woods system. Within a year, all the currencies had unpegged themselves from the dollar and floated freely, and everything kind of went to shit in the 70s. In 1973 and again in 1979, oil prices suddenly quadrupled overnight after geopolitical crisis in the Middle East, sending inflation through the roof and plunging the global economy into chaos. Let me explain this. When the price of oil quadrupled overnight, the cost of producing almost everything increased. Oil isn't just something you put in your car. The entire modern economy depends on it. The whole logistics and transport sector, all the factories, heating, agriculture, transport. And then there's everything made from oil. Polyester t-shirts, toothbrushes, shampoo bottles, packaging, plastic water bottles, car interiors, toys, medical gear. In short, everything. So when the oil price quadrupled, everything else became a lot more expensive. And when everything gets more expensive, that's called inflation. Production also became a lot more expensive, and people could afford less things. So companies produced less and had to lay off workers. So unemployment skyrocketed and economic growth stagnated across most advanced capitalist economies. The oil shocks, accelerating inflation, stagnating economic growth, and rising unemployment across most advanced capitalist economies all combined into an economic nightmare.
stagflation.
And while ordinary people were dealing with everything becoming more expensive and getting laid off and just overall economic chaos, there was another group watching the 1970s very closely. Business elites. Because something had been happening quietly since the 1940s. Something they really, really did not like. Their share of national income had been falling for decades.
During the Golden Age, workers got a bigger slice of the pie.
And wealth inequality had been shrinking. The richest people in society were, frankly, getting slightly less rich relative to everyone else.
And during the Golden Age, where the economy was booming, elites didn't really mind, because while their slice was slightly shrinking relative to the whole pie, the pie itself was growing so massively that they were still getting massively richer every year.
But that changed when the pie stopped massively expanding year after year.
Suddenly, the size of business elite's slice mattered again, a lot. Profits were falling, and their relative economic power had been slipping.
And by the mid-1970s, business elites weren't just annoyed. They were in full-blown panic mode. But every crisis brings opportunities. And in the 1970s, the opportunity was to redesign the system in favour of those at the top. This had already been in the works for a while. If you've seen my Who Really Controls the Economy video, you will remember that business elites had already been building think tanks and launching propaganda campaigns for decades. If you want to understand the scale of all the propaganda efforts and want to understand all of the mechanisms of it on a deeper level, I highly recommend watching that one after this video. Anyways, up until the early 70s,
the people actually running government still mostly believed in so-called embedded liberalism, the post-war idea that markets needed to be regulated and society needed to be protected.
By the early 1970s, business elites weren't just lobbying from the outside anymore.
They were starting to gain influence inside government and were ready to shape policy in their favour.
I wanted to interrupt the video shortly because I don't know if you can tell, but a lot of research goes into making videos like these, and also video production, video editing is kind of a lot of work. So if you want to support the channel, it will mean the world if you checked out the Patreon. I also organise a book club on there where we read the books together that I use for my videos and get together bi-weekly to discuss them. So if you're interested, check that out. The links are in the description. And also, it will mean the world if you subscribe to the channel. Anyways, back to the video. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence that government elites were now embedded within government institutions is the Powell Memo.
It was written by Lewis Powell, a corporate lawyer who would soon become a Supreme Court justice. This document had the form of a confidential memo to the US Chamber of Commerce,
urging corporations to launch a coordinated, long-term political and ideological campaign to take back control of universities, media, law, and public opinion.
Powell wrote, "The American economic system is under broad attack." He was telling business elites that this is a time for drastic action. Business must learn the lesson that political power is necessary. And he was egging them on to take over the media.
The national television networks should be monitored in the same way that textbooks should be kept under constant surveillance. So why does the Powell Memo matter? Because it's the moment a future Supreme Court justice basically said the quiet part out loud, that corporations needed to retake the country, culturally, politically, and academically, and that the 1970s crisis was their chance to do it. And it worked. The American Chamber of Commerce expanded its membership dramatically from 60,000 businesses in 1972 to over 250,000 just 10 years later, and amassed an immense campaign chest for research and lobbying activities in the process. The Business Roundtable was established in 1972 as an organisation of CEOs dedicated to the aggressive pursuit of political power for the corporation. Numerous neoliberal think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute were formed with corporate backing. Business was learning to spend as a class. In other words, by the late 1970s, business elites had already rebuilt their ideological infrastructure. What they needed next was institutional power, and that arrived with Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, essentially the head of the United States Central Bank, in 1979. And his appointment signaled a dramatic shift in US economic governance. It marked the transition from the emphasis on employment and economic stability to a new regime centered on inflation control and financial discipline. His actions is what economists now refer to as the Volcker shock, a set of aggressive monetary policies rooted in the belief that controlling inflation was more important than maintaining employment. It was the moment monetary policy got reoriented towards protecting the value of capital rather than safeguarding employment. In his draconian shift in monetary policy, Paul Volcker massively hiked interest rates. By July 1981, the nominal interest rate stood close to 20%, the highest in modern US history. But why did he do that? This is where monetarism enters the story. If you watched this video, you'll probably remember Milton Friedman, the economist most associated with neoliberalism, whose work was heavily financed by business elites. It was his theory, monetarism, which framed inflation as the ultimate economic threat, and it framed unemployment as a necessary sacrifice. So monetarism offered Volcker the intellectual and political cover he needed for this shift in monetary policy, away from the Keynesian commitment to full employment and economic stability, and towards protecting the value of capital, which had been eroded by years of high inflation. Volcker's extraordinary rate hikes did exactly what they were supposed to do. They deliberately pushed the economy into recession. And as demand contracted, factories began to close. Entire industrial regions, the American Midwest, the Rust Belt, were devastated. Unemployment surged above 10%. And while the Volcker shock didn't crush unions through new legislation, it weakened them dramatically. You can't really bargain for higher wages when your industry is collapsing, and you can't strike when your factory is closing. Volcker had changed the balance of power. Labour was weakened and capital was strengthened. And we'll get into what that meant for workers in a second when we talk about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. But first, I don't want to just talk about the US, the UK, and other advanced capitalist economies, because inequality affects everyone across the globe. The impact of the Volcker shock didn't end at US borders. Most global finance is denominated in dollars. US interest rates effectively set global interest rates.
So when Volcker pushed rates towards 20%, developing countries who had borrowed dollars just a few years earlier saw their interest payments on those loans explode.
Loans that had seemed manageable in the 1970s became unpayable almost overnight.
The crisis began in Latin America, with Mexico defaulting in 1982, and then spread to Brazil, Argentina, Chile. This cascade became known as the Latin American debt crisis, which then expanded into a wider third world debt crisis, as many sub-Saharan African countries and parts of Asia were also plunged into crisis because they could no longer afford the interest payments on their dollar-denominated loans.
When countries could no longer afford the exploding interest payments, they had to turn somewhere for help. And that somewhere was the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which was also established at the Bretton Woods conference. But the IMF did not offer rescue packages out of generosity. Every loan came with strict conditions attached. These conditions were called structural adjustment programs, and they forced countries to adopt a very specific set of economic policies, mainly the privatization of public assets, spending cuts to welfare programs, and austerity across the board. These structural adjustment programs also encouraged deregulation and opening domestic markets to foreign corporations and remove protections from workers and local industries. Basically, the IMF used the international debt crisis to push a very specific set of economic policies onto the global south. For many countries, this wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was a transformation of the entire social and political order, and the effects were devastating.
Across all these countries, poverty increased, public services collapsed, inequality exploded, and economic sovereignty was effectively handed over to global financial institutions. David Harvey calls this accumulation by dispossession, the modern continuation of historical, imperial and colonial practices of extraction and appropriation.
All the while, political leaders in the United States and the United Kingdom were preparing to implement this new economic order at home. In 1979 and 1980, two political leaders came into power who would turn this economic revolution into a political one. Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US. I talk more about Ronald Reagan and his corporate friends in this video, but the short version is that he got elected on a message that framed government as a problem, not the solution. According to Reagan, taxes, social programs, and regulation were what was holding America back and what supposedly had caused this recession. And he was very effective at telling that story. His main campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again," if that rings any bells. By the way, quick break, because this entire video is basically about ordinary people getting screwed over by systems they don't control. And one of those systems is a giant and very creepy network of data brokers selling your personal information online. If you Google yourself, you'll see what I mean. Your old jobs, your relatives, your phone numbers, your email address can all be found online. And they're not just sitting there, they're being collected and sold by data brokers to advertisers, companies, and in the worst case, scammers. You can send requests to data brokers to delete your data, but there's hundreds of thousands of them, and manually sending these requests to these data broker companies is just going to take ages, not even to mention following up or anything. So I've been trying out Incogni, who is also sponsoring this video. They're a service that has automatized the whole process of sending these requests out and getting your data down from those data broker websites. And here's how it works. You make your account, enter in the bare minimum info they need to find your exposed data, and authorize them to contact those hundreds of data brokers on your behalf and get your data removed. And they don't just remove the data once, they keep resending the requests and removing you again and again from these data broker lists because the data always kind of grows back. And the coolest part is the custom removals feature. If you find any website exposing your info, you can just send Incogni the link and their privacy team removes it for you. Honestly, if you care about your privacy just a little bit, this is the easiest win ever. Incogni is also the first and only data removal service that is independently verified, which is quite reassuring because this industry itself is full of questionable companies. So if you want your data taken off the internet and disappear from these creepy databases,
You can get 60% off the annual plan by using my link.
thank you Incogni for sponsoring this video. And now back to Reagan and Thatcher. Remember how Volcker's interest rate hikes weakened labour and strengthened capital power? Well, unions were just about to take another hit. But this time it wouldn't come from central bankers, but from politicians. The first major front of that political offensive opened not in the US, but in the UK. Because Britain had already gone through its own version of economic collapse, long before Reagan had even entered the White House.
In 1976, the UK was broke and was forced to go to the IMF for a bailout. And just like the global south, obviously that bailout came with austerity conditions. Cuts to public spending, wage restraint and a deep squeeze on the welfare state.
The resulting austerity program eroded public services and reduced real wages. The result was social and economic chaos. By the late 1970s, the UK was stuck in the same economic nightmare as the US, stagflation. High inflation and high unemployment and stagnating economic growth at the same time. And this shattered faith in the post-war economic model. Throughout the late 1970s, everyone in the UK was pretty unhappy. Inflation had made everything more expensive, and workers who wanted to make ends meet would strike a lot. So Britain kind of got paralysed by constant strikes and collapsing public services. And it all culminated in what became known as the Winter of Discontent. This breakdown created the perfect political environment for Margaret Thatcher, who campaigned on one central message.
The unions were too powerful and she was going to break them and radically restructure the British economy.
And so she did. Economically, Thatcher embraced the same logic that had guided Volcker in the United States.
Monetarism. She believed inflation was the central threat, and controlling it required high interest rates, spending cuts, and letting unemployment rise, even if it caused enormous social pain. It didn't help that Milton Friedman was one of her advisors. So the Bank of England raised interest rates to 17%, one of the highest levels in British history.
And just like in the United States, this pushed the country into a deep recession. Unemployment surged and manufacturing, the backbone of working class Britain, collapsed. And I know there's going to be loads of people in the comments being like, manufacturing in Britain got wiped out because of cheap Chinese imports. But that's actually not true. China didn't become a major manufacturing exporter till the late 1990s. British manufacturing collapsed in the early 1980s.
Because monetarism pushed interest rates to 17%, which drove up the value of the pound, making British exports impossibly expensive.
So entire industries became uncompetitive overnight, and hundreds of thousands of industrial jobs simply disappeared. And as unemployment rose and communities were pushed to the brink, labour conflict intensified. The UK slid into a full-on confrontation between the state and the unions. A confrontation that would soon erupt into one of the most defining political battles of the decade. The 1984 to 1985 miners' strike. The coal miners were not just any workers. The National Union of Mine Workers was one of the strongest and most politically powerful unions in Britain. And coal wasn't just any industry. It had powered Britain's industrial economy for the last century. And even in the 1980s, coal was still crucial.
Most of the country's electricity depended on it, and entire regions relied on mining. That's why the Miners' Union was one of the most powerful labour organisations in the country.
But to Margaret Thatcher, the miners were an obstacle. In her eyes, you couldn't restructure the British economy or break the power of labour without confronting them. And unlike previous governments, Margaret Thatcher wanted that confrontation. She prepared for it.
Years before confronting the miners, her government massively increased coal imports, filled up cold storage depots, built up police forces, and passed laws that weakened unions' ability to strike. And then she announced coal pit closures as part of her broader policy of privatising large nationalised industries,
which she believed would lead to greater efficiency. What followed was a year-long brutal struggle. Mass pickets, police violence, surveillance, mass arrests, and entire mining communities being starved out.
Thatcher famously described the miners as the enemy within, language one would think is usually reserved for terrorists or traitors.
But this was not just a labour dispute. It was a political project to break working class organisation in Britain. And while Thatcher had been preparing for her showdown with the unions since 1979, across the Atlantic, the United States saw its own defining confrontation with organised labour in 1981. Just months into his presidency, Ronald Reagan faced a strike by the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO,
short for Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organisation. These weren't factory workers, they were federal white-collar employees responsible for the safety of the entire aviation system. And it's not like they were asking for anything radical. They were striking for shorter hours, better staffing, and basic safety reforms. When PATCO went on strike, Reagan declared it illegal and gave the workers 48 hours to return to work. Most refused, so Reagan fired more than 11,000 air traffic controllers on the spot. and banned them from federal employment for life.
Also, a lot more history goes into that episode. A big factor how Reagan got away with using thousands of less experienced replacement air traffic controllers was pure luck. The weather was unusually calm and sunny, which made it possible to keep planes moving without a catastrophe. Anyway, this single act sent a message to employers across the country.
You no longer need to negotiate. You can simply replace your workers.
And I know nowadays we constantly see news about thousands of workers getting laid off from some tech company and getting replaced by AI. But back in 1981, nothing like that had ever happened. And it didn't stop there. Once Reagan had shattered the power of organised labour, he moved on to reshape the entire American economy.
Reagan unleashed an aggressive wave of deregulation across major industries. Airlines, telecommunications, banking, finance, entire sectors were opened up to corporate consolidation and profit-driven restructuring.
In the name of the free market. But as David Harvey put it, freedom of the market has turned out to be little more than the spread of monopoly power and Coca-Cola everywhere without constraint. But Ronald Reagan didn't just enable that. Most importantly, he slashed taxes for the rich. In his 8 years in office, Ronald Reagan slashed the top marginal tax rate, that is, the tax rate that the richest people are supposed to pay, from 70% to 28%. One of, if not the largest, transfer of wealth in modern history. While taxes on the rich plummeted, social spending was gutted.
Housing programs, health services, welfare benefits, all cut in the name of fiscal discipline.
And the result was predictable. Homelessness skyrocketed, poverty deepened, and wealth inequality began the climb we're still witnessing today. Real wages flatlined. And for the first time since World War II, productivity kept rising, but worker pay didn't. The economy was growing, but basically only people who already had a lot of stuff benefited from it. All of the deregulation fueled a massive consolidation of corporate power. Wall Street was deregulated and finance started to swallow the real economy. By the late 1980s, the financial sector became the main driving force of the global economy. But it wasn't just Republicans deregulating everything. Reagan had made it politically acceptable to hand more and more power to Wall Street. So even when Democrats came into power later, they just also hopped on the deregulation train. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton dismantled the last barrier between commercial banks and investment banks by repealing the Glass-Steagall Act and opening the floodgates to an explosion of financial engineering and the emergence of an exponentially growing financial derivatives market.
A derivative is basically a financial bet on whether something else, a stock, a loan, a currency, will go up or down in value.
It's not real money, it's basically financial betting. Let me know if you want a video where I go deeper into that shady world. Anyways, the point is that derivatives destabilize the entire financial system. And to illustrate the insane growth of the financial derivatives market, here are some numbers.
In 2002, humanity's total income was about 50 trillion, and the value of financial bets, derivatives, was already 70 trillion. By 2007, humanity's income had grown to around 75 trillion, which is a pretty respectable 33% growth in 5 years.
but the value of financial bets had exploded to 750 trillion. And this was the perfect setup for the economy to collapse in 2008. And even after Wall Street drove the economy into the absolute ground by reckless betting, they still didn't get properly regulated. But that's a story for another video. The facts are that we're living in a world that people like Volcker, Thatcher, Reagan, and the people at the IMF built under the influence of business elites. A world where financial markets matter more than people, where housing is seen as an investment and not as a human necessity, where wages stagnate but CEO pay explodes, and where ever-increasing wealth inequality is just innately baked into the economy. But the upside to it is simple. If a handful of politicians and bankers could redesign the global economy to favour the people at the top, then we can redesign it again. We can raise taxes on billionaires, regulate the casino that finance has become, and rebuild public services. We don't have to wake up at 4 a.m. and blame ourselves for an economy that was designed to fail us. The important thing is to try to understand it, educate ourselves, challenge the status quo, and eventually reshape our economy. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. If you want to learn more about economics and economic history, check out my other videos. It would mean the world if you liked and subscribed. And yeah, see you soon. Bye.